This is Duke University.
Thank you very much, and I'm glad to be here, Julie, and also glad that so many of you came out today. I thought that Afghanistan might be interesting, but I was hoping that President Obama would delay making the announcement which he made yesterday to keep people's mind on Afghanistan. I thought we had enough interesting in it, and then it turns out it's on the headline, so it's even more a matter of everyday and present-day conversation. So I just want to say two things about Afghanistan at Duke. One is that this is not the first time there's been an event that involves Afghanistan at this university. And I want to note for some of you who have followed events or read about this part of the world long before 9/11, we had two very senior scholars, Louis and Nancy Dupre, who were at Duke for almost 15 years, both of whom have written extensively on Afghanistan, lived there. I was told by Julie that Nancy still writes cookbooks on Afghanistan, but she certainly was doing more than that when she was here as a visiting professor along with her husband Louis, who is considered one of the great American experts on Afghan history and events. Also noteworthy is our colleague, our former colleague in history, John Richards, John F. Richards, who was a specialist on South Asia, but also included Afghanistan in his watch. And at one point, he taught a course in the history department called Opium and Outlaws. So I said, what's that have to do with Afghanistan? He said, for many people, those are the only two things worthy of study in Afghanistan. So opium will come up in our conversations today, but just to let you know that John Richards, who also was responsible for having Duke as the base for the first American Institute of Afghan Studies. When it opened at Duke, and John Richards was the president of it. So we are not shy of or absent interest in Afghanistan. But what brings us here today is that there are many issues that some of you have been following, all of us have had as concern. And I was privileged to be able to talk to Nathan Hodge last week. We actually had an interview because we weren't sure if the communication would be good enough to have it today. So rather than tell you about that interview, it was 40 minutes, it would take all our time. I'd rather simply defer Nathan and ask him to give us an update on what he sees, and if there's not a simple, but if there is a comprehensive answer to the question posed by President Obama in the last 24 hours, namely if President Karzai does not sign the security agreement, will the only outcome be the zero option, which is military talk for all American troops withdrawing from Afghanistan by the end of 2014. So that's the central question. And Nathan, we welcome your perspectives on anything on the ground today, but especially hope you can address the question which President Obama, who apparently had not talked to President Karzai for 8 months, but felt this is a serious enough issue that he called him to say, we're pulling out if you don't sign on. So if you can give us commentary on that, we would welcome it. Nathan.
Right, and thanks very much for having me, and thanks for hosting me here. You're right. You're beginning with a good observation that relations between Washington and Kabul have been extremely frosty in the past few months. It goes back even before the Loya Jirga, which was held here in November, where an assembly that was actually convened by President Karzai to deliberate over whether or not to actually sign the security deal that would allow U.S. troops to stay on here, voted overwhelmingly in favor of it, and then voted in favor of keeping some limited contingent of U.S. troops here. And that's seen as very important by Afghanistan's political elite for a lot of reasons. The primary reason is that the military presence comes with strings attached, that is money. The Afghan government at this point can't pay for the salaries of its army, for its police. As I've said to you in the interview that we had earlier, Afghanistan is still a ward of the international community. That means that it depends on international aid just to fund the operations of the government here. So there's a lot of anxiety and there's a lot of concern, especially among, again, Afghanistan's political elite, as well as among ordinary residents of Kabul, people we talk to every day, about what will happen if in fact the zero option is exercised. And that was basically the message that President Obama was giving to President Karzai yesterday, which was that the zero option, that is, the full and total withdrawal of U.S. troops, is an option, and the military has to start thinking about planning around that. There's been some build up to this for months now. Susan Rice, for instance, came out here and had, by most accounts, a meeting with President Karzai that didn't go very well. On his last visit here, Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel actually didn't meet with President Karzai, so relations have been very frosty. But President Karzai is a man, if all goes to plan, who's on the way out. He can't serve another term in office, and he will be stepping down after elections which are slated for the 5th of April. But that's with a big caveat. The first thing that needs to be noted here is that there's likely to be a second round of elections, which could drag out the whole process of selecting a successor to President Karzai until later in the summer. And there may be protests, there may be allegations of fraud. The 2009 election in Afghanistan was also marred by allegations of fraud. So the international community has really lowered expectations. The standard for this election is not that it will be, as the favorite phrase goes, free and fair, but it's going to be something that's, I think, I forget the phrase that they use, but something broadly acceptable to Afghans, credible. So that's going to be a really, really important political transition here. If Afghanistan pulls it off, on the other hand, it's going to be a pretty major thing. That's going to be the first real proper democratic transition between governments in the country's modern history. And so we're all watching this keenly to see what exactly is going to happen, as well as to see what the prospects are for peace in the region, peace in the country, because Afghanistan still faces a pretty resilient insurgency. And the worry is, of course, that Afghanistan's army and police won't be able to hold the line much the way the Afghan government was not able, fundamentally collapsed after Soviet support dried up with the collapse of the Soviet Union in around 1992.
So Nathan, we're going to have more questions for you, but just on that one point, because it's going to come up for a lot of people. One of the statements that was made very frequently after President Obama's phone call with President Karzai yesterday was if the zero option was pursued, if American troops were to completely withdraw, that 30% of the Afghan force would desert. Is that an exaggerated figure, or should we all be worried about that as well as the other consequences of the withdrawal?
I'm not quite sure where that 30% figure comes from. And for the moment, we haven't seen any kind of evidence of desertions or defections on that kind of scale here. Though it is worth noting that the Afghan army and the Afghan police have been bearing the brunt of the casualties over the past year, since basically midsummer of last year. It's actually the Afghan army, the Afghan police that have been doing the bulk of the fighting, not U.S. troops, not international troops. Just this past weekend, there was an incident where 21 Afghan soldiers were killed when their checkpoint and their outpost was attacked in eastern Kunar province. This prompted a sort of a wave of anger, of popular anger. Here in Afghanistan, there was a very public funeral ceremony for the soldiers where the bodies were handed over to their families. And there's been a lot of concern that the Afghan military is not necessarily going to be getting the kind of support that it's enjoyed and depended on from the coalition in the past years, where, for instance, they were able to call on backup and support, air support, things like that, medical evacuation from the coalition. So this is a really big deal. This was really kind of a galvanizing moment over this past weekend. So, and the highest casualties from what we can tell and what we've been told by the military here are among things like the Afghan local police who are sort of a village militia force that's been mentored by the U.S. And funded by the coalition. They've been targeted for lots of attacks. So we're not at the point certainly where we would see military being on the verge of collapse or mass defection, but the larger concern going down the road is that if things aren't going well, and if the funding isn't coming in, that things like these kinds of militias can revert to their old ways of behavior, which was, militias that basically prey on local people to generate income, collecting money at checkpoints, things like that. And that gets us back to the problems we had in the 1990s, where there was very predatory behavior during the Civil War by different armed groups, which actually led in part to the rise of the Taliban, because the Taliban were seen, especially in their sort of the southern heartland of Afghanistan, as a force for law and order that was able to deliver very brutal but swift justice and protect people against this kind of predatory behavior by warlords. So no one wants to see a situation where Afghanistan reverts to civil war, where you have a situation where Kabul, a good chunk of it, was leveled and some really nasty fighting in the 1990s, but it's very unpredictable which way the situation can go.
Well, thank you for that broad introduction, and let me now turn it over to Jayne Huckerby, who will give us insight in a few points that concern her in thinking about women and human rights in Afghanistan at this point in time.
Thank you. One particular concern when talking about the security deal and zero option and so forth is really what happens to women and women's human rights defenders in the event of a total drawdown and so forth. It's particularly important to note the escalation of violence and insecurity against women and girls in Afghanistan, and really a very particular feature of this violence and insecurity, which has been the squeezing of women between, on the one hand, attacks from the Taliban insurgency, including, for example, attacks on female officials, assassination attempts, and so forth, but also having women being under increasing threat from the government. So it's sort of, when I talk to my colleagues in Afghanistan, it's like we're fighting on both fronts. We have the Taliban on the one hand, government not helping, making things worse in many circumstances. To give some examples of the ways in which the government has been not conducive to women's rights protection, one big area of concern has been talks of negotiations between Karzai and the Taliban and what that would mean for the rollback of women's rights post the election. And also the fact that women have not been included in those talks at all has been an issue. But alongside that too, you've seen a lot of new laws that the Parliament has sought to introduce that are really rollbacks of quite hard-fought gains for women's rights protection in Afghanistan. One thing I was talking about earlier is, very recently the Parliament sought to abolish a quota law, which had secured women's representation of 25% in provincial councils. Women advocates had to sort of directed their attention to kind of keep that law, and it ended up keeping it, but reducing the quota to 20%. But sort of this issue is you're fighting to maintain existing gains whilst also trying to advance laws. Another two laws that were recently introduced, and these, I think the important thing to note, these kind of came a little bit from nowhere in the sense that they weren't on the radar, and they are really indicative of a broader environment of rollbacks in women's rights. These two laws were one giving fathers greater control over children in respect of in terms of arranging marriage. The second one was a proposed amendment to domestic violence law, which would ban family members from giving evidence in cases of domestic violence and abuse, which would essentially make it impossible to pursue any prosecution for family-based, for crimes. The good thing is that Karzai sent that back to Parliament with a request to look at that again, but it's a little bit unclear as to what the fate of that law will actually be. And again, the fact that it was even introduced and the gravity of what it sought to do is a really bad indicia of where things are at for women's rights protection in Afghanistan. I'm just going to add two quick things, that these issues are really exacerbated by current developments. As Nathan mentioned, Afghanistan is a ward of the international community, but particularly women's rights advocacy in Afghanistan is a ward of the international community, in the sense that pretty much all funding for women's rights groups comes from international donors, international assistance, and so forth. And so there's a lot of concern about what a drawdown looks like, what the support will be, who will be remaining advocates for women's rights in Afghanistan in that event. There's a lot of trepidation around the upcoming elections, of course, not only in terms of concern about the number of candidates who are not conducive to women's rights protection, either because they're fundamentalists or they may be former warlords and so forth. But it's a broader concern that in a post-reconciliation phase in Afghanistan, that women's rights will be bartered away. That'll be part of what gets dropped off the table as an attempt to promote a cohesive government structure. I'm just going to keep my comments there, and maybe I can sort of reflect more upon, so just a quick note, my work in this area has mainly been at the international level of trying to develop frameworks for how we think about supporting women's rights in post-conflict, and working with women's rights groups in Afghanistan to try and think about how to actually implement these on the ground as well. So I'm happy to talk about that going forward.
Well, thank you, Jayne. And before we turn to having questions from the floor, I'd like to ask one question from Nathan, which goes back to the issues that some of the Jayne just discussed about women's issues and concerns for women's human rights, both in what's happened now and what's likely to happen after the elections. And Nathan, you mentioned a lot about the process and transparency, the need for transparency, and the hope that these would be the first democratically elected officials to come out of Afghanistan, and that this would be post-occupation. This would be a very hopeful sign. But we haven't talked, or at least I haven't heard any discussion yet, about specific candidates. So I'd like to ask you to comment on specific candidates, and I guess I must confess I have a specific interest in one, Ashraf Ghani Hamazai, who I'm sure you've heard of and probably even met. But I knew him when he was still an academic in America before he even joined the World Bank. For those of you who don't know him, he was an American academic. He did serve in the World Bank. He gave up all these positions of luxury and comfort, or at least viability, in 2001 and went back to Afghanistan. As far as I know, has been active in various circles in Afghanistan, and stood as a candidate and placed fourth, I think, in the last presidential elections of 2009. But is now standing again in the elections, and I believe gave quite a rousing opening talk at the beginning of this month, opening his campaign speech. But I'd like to know from Nathan, who's on the ground there, what he thinks of the candidates in particular by name, and specifically if he can comment on the viability, the opportunity, the likelihood of Ashraf Ghani as a presidential candidate.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, Ashraf Ghani had a very prominent career in academia. He was a professor at Johns Hopkins well before and his return to Afghanistan, and is well known in the international community and is well known in development circles, is a prominent thinker about development issues. And but as you mentioned, he didn't have a very good showing in the 2009 elections. You said he placed fourth, but the actual percentage of votes that he received was quite small. He's come into, I think it's fair to say, more prominence in the past couple of years. He was the chief transition advisor to President Karzai, which meant that he spent a lot of time traveling around the country, meeting with provincial and district leaders to talk about how this process of handing over the responsibility for security would happen across the country as U.S. troops drew down. So he has also joined forces with Abdul Rashid Dostum, who is a prominent former Uzbek warlord who can be counted on to draw a good number of votes in the north, which is an interesting move. One of the things that happened after he joined forces with Dostum was that Dostum issued an apology for some of the I don't know what the delicate term for it is, but the abuses, the misdeeds that happened in the past during the Civil War, which is a pretty remarkable thing. But to get back to the question of women's rights, there's another prominent candidate, Abdul Rasul Sayyaf, who is also a former Mujahideen commander. Sayyaf has cast himself as he's probably the most conservative of the leading candidates. And his candidacy has raised a lot of concern in diplomatic circles about his commitment to women's rights. And it was very interesting for me to go in and attend his campaign rally at what's called the Loya Jirga Hall here in Kabul, and see it was there was only a very, very small group of women who attended. And Sayaf actually went on sort of an extended riff about sort of addressing international criticism of his record on women's rights. And one of the points that he made was that he actually supported the rights of women to exercise their political rights, to go out and to vote, to be in the workplace, to work outside of the home. But in addition to women's rights, he also emphasized, and this is, I think, code word for the audience that he was addressing, that he was interested in women's protecting the dignity of women, which I think some people, women's rights advocates, would view with skepticism. That is dignity according to whom and who decides. Obviously, this is going to be a problem, and he's faced a lot of questions about it. He's one of probably about 6 front runners, and we can probably, if members of the audience have questions about them, we can kind of game out a little bit what their chances are. But one of the people who's seen as one of the likely front runners is Abdullah. Abdullah, who was formerly the foreign minister here, he ran in, he came in second place in the last election. And that was an election, of course, that was marred by serious allegations of fraud. And he has said to us, he has said to this paper, that his main enemy in this campaign is going to be fraud. So there's going to be a lot of concern about, especially in insecure areas, how are you going to be able to monitor the turnout? Is there going to be ballot stuffing in places where security is bad? How do you run an election in parts of the country where people are worried about Taliban intimidation, where they're worried about violence on the day of the polls? And of course, everyone here in Kabul as well is bracing for possible violence.
Well, thank you, Nathan. I think I'd like to ask Jayne for any follow-up, and then we'll open it up to the floor.
Yeah, I mean, just to say that definitely thinking about, this is a real focus right now of a number of women's rights groups on thinking about how to assess candidates for their record on women's rights. So there is a draft women's rights charter that's been circulating and being debated amongst women's groups that will be used as kind of a checklist for assessing candidates. And this is really a big area of focus and concern right now for the community work on these issues.
Well, I have a number of other questions that I might ask Nathan, but I'd like to, first of all, open up the floor for anybody here who's come who has questions, and we have microphones on either side. So if you have questions, if you have perspective, if you would like to have the benefit of talking to somebody from Kabul, which you're not likely to have at home on a blog or Twitter, this is your chance. And please just identify yourself. Please just identify yourself as you ask the question.
Hi, I'm Jeff Gustafson. I'm a master's student at the Nicholas School here, looking at how the military has used environmental intervention, agriculture development as a tool of counterinsurgency. My question to you is, given the withdrawal promise, I would imagine that development aid and development reach in Afghanistan is going to shrink dramatically as well. I'm wondering what you think of the footprint of the development work that's gone in. We've poured, billions of dollars into Afghanistan with murky results. So yeah, what do you see as sort of the future of this important development work, and what will be left behind?
That's a great question, and it gets to the heart of a lot of the research and writing that I've done. It's really been an extraordinary experiment in what I would call armed state building, which is the U.S. military has gotten involved in doing development work on a scale that really hadn't been seen since the Vietnam War. If we look at just the raw numbers, I think it's over $90 million has been spent. 90 billion, that's billion with a B, has been spent on reconstruction and development work in Afghanistan, and a good chunk of that money has been spent by the traditional aid agencies. That's like the U.S. Agency for International Development. It's been spent through the military. The military has had to, in part because they have the manpower and also because the Pentagon has the money, they have overseen a really good share of everything, from that's rebuilding schools and universities here to helping build up local government, to building roads and infrastructure. So it's really been an extraordinary nation-building project, even though the military has long liked to say that it wasn't interested in the military and in nation building. It's become their mission. And counterinsurgency doctrine sort of enshrined that and basically made it a central part, which is tools that were available to commanders were things like what's called SERP. I think it's called the Commander's Emergency Response Program. So millions and millions of dollars are available to units that are in the field to spend on everything from digging wells to laying asphalt. What the military, though, I think as you rightly pointed out, has learned is that aid is not easy. Throwing money at a problem doesn't necessarily fix things. It very often causes new problems. If you're a commander, for instance, with a base and you're building a road to win the loyalty or the support or just discourage a local community from having people lay mines or improvise explosive devices on your road, you might find that there's another community that's been left out of the equation. Turning on a fire hose of dollars at problems doesn't necessarily solve everything. And we can look at it like in a place like Helmand province, which is the opium-growing heartland of the country, which has been the focus of all kinds of different interesting experiments in trying to find ways of alternative livelihoods for people who depend on growing opium poppy to make a living, and trying to encourage them to plant different kinds of crops, whether it's saffron or something else. And none of this has really changed the basic fact that a good chunk of the GDP here is through the illicit economy, that's through growing opium. It hasn't weaned farmers away from what's a very good and a durable crop, one that is a great hedge against uncertainty. I think that Afghanistan will probably be studied for a long time as, for better or worse, a laboratory of all kinds of failed experiments in nation building and counterinsurgency, and trying to figure out ways, because in a lot of ways the military has gone through a really steep learning curve, both with Iraq and Afghanistan, of trying to learn and making some of the mistakes that the international aid community or the development community has made over the course of 50 or 60 years since the end of the Second World War. But they've had to do it under much more difficult circumstances. That is, they're delivering aid while being shot at. So, that adds a new level of complexity to the problem. So, I think one would hope in future there will be other, to use the military term, there will be other contingencies, there will be other Afghanistans. But the hope would be that there's not going to be, despite the exhaustion and fatigue, because when everyone looks at Afghanistan or everyone looks at Iraq, we can tell even in our own newspaper, people are tired, the public is tired of this kind of involvement. But one would hope that there's some kind of serious study and all of the lessons of how to deliver aid in these kinds of complex circumstances are just going to be thrown out the window. And so it's good to hear, and it's very heartening that there are people who are actually still looking at these kinds of problems and hopefully drawing some of the lessons from the past 12 years of involvement here in Afghanistan, and hopefully figuring out ways to do it better and do it right.
If I can add to that, I think it's very important when we talk about the move to have development as a countering violent extremism tool. That actually has huge consequences for women's rights, which we don't talk about enough. An obvious one is, when you have the military being involved in aid distribution, the military do not have the attention to a gender perspective in the ways in which you're trained to do as Development 101. So I looked at this issue particularly in non-kinetic environments like Kenya and in parts of Pakistan, where, just to give a very concrete example, you may have the military going in and building a well as part of a changing hearts and minds activity, and CVE activity in a community. But because they're not development trained, they will, for example, not consult women about the well building. They will move things, they'll sort of make it difficult for women to access water and so forth, which has a really bad outcome for women's rights in the community. Another big challenge of the move toward development as a CVE tool has been a focus on promoting the livelihood of young men and boys. So very often, again, to give a very concrete example, you have a lot of AFRICOM activities, development activities in Kenya that go into communities where on every indicia, women and girls are infinitely worse off than the young men in the community. but because of the application of a CVE lens, are now putting money into livelihoods of boys over girls. And so there's a lot of, I think we have to really, as part of the broader debate on talking about the shift toward development as CVE, and that's now an official USAID policy. I'm happy to talk with you. I've spent a lot of time looking at this and talking with AID and the Pentagon and state about these issues. We've really got to think about what this means in terms of women's rights issues too, apart from just a general question about development and what it means to have the military doing development.
Thank you, Jayne. Next question, please. Yes. Just say who you are first.
Hi, my name is Priti, and I'm a master's student at Sanford School of Public Policy. My question is to you, Mr. Hodge, and sorry, it'll sound a little vague because there are a couple of aspects to it, but what I'm really trying to understand is what's exactly happening right now with Taliban. It seems the Afghanistan government is very keen to engage with them in some sort of political dialogue. At some point, I do remember that America had also tried to engage with them and involve them. But then somewhere in between, there is some missing information which I can't seem to put together as to where and when it happened that US and Afghanistan together did not want to sort of involve Taliban. And this is one part of the question, where did this little bit of information is missing, which is what I'm trying to understand. And the second part is, how much do you think political leverage Taliban has at this point in time, considering the, at least from the mainstream media, the image that I'm getting is that people have pretty much revolted against them, and they do not really enjoy the kind of popular support they might have enjoyed in the 90s, with these people now killing 21 soldiers while they were asleep in Afghanistan, and those sort of atrocities being committed. Why is it that Karzai is so interested in engaging with them? Do they have that sort of political hold on people that they still remain to be relevant? Because so is Pakistan engaging with them. I mean, there is something that's...
Thank you for the question. Yes, Nathan.
All great questions. Very interesting and perfect, great timing as well. Today, for instance, there was a demonstration or a march, a very small rally in Kabul that was in support of the troops who were commemorating the troops who were killed. And some of the comments that we saw on Afghan social media, and Afghanistan does have a new sliver of what you could call a middle class that is very online and very connected. And people were basically saying things like, why is it that Karzai addresses the Taliban as, brother Taliban? This is his way of, I think, trying to reach out to the insurgency in the hopes of reconciliation. But that's the kind of rhetoric that angers a lot of people. Certainly among what you would say this sort of urbanizing class of Afghans. The city of Kabul itself has just grown massively over the past 10 years. It's a population of around 5 million people here. And there's no turning back the clock in a lot of ways for them, going back to the days of Taliban rule. So, what's the status with peace talks? Okay, so we have a situation here where there was an attempt to bring the Taliban into formal negotiations midsummer of last year, around the time that there was also this security transition going on. But the entire enterprise fell apart over, in part, President Karzai's outrage over the opening of a Taliban office in Qatar, which seemed to have the trappings to the Afghan government of a government in exile or a government in waiting. There was this moment where they raised the Taliban flag over their office, and this infuriated President Karzai. The whole thing kind of fell apart. Now the presidential palace has been telling us in the past week or so that there may be a new opening, that there are former Taliban ministers, former Taliban field commanders, and former Taliban diplomats who are in the United Arab Emirates, who are willing to talk peace. And the hope is that they may represent some sort of new opening. That being said, the Taliban have disavowed them. The leader of this group is a person named Aghajan Motasim, who's been essentially disavowed by the Taliban. So there's a lot of intrigue and a lot of sort of speculation about whether or not President Karzai and his High Peace Council could actually come to the table and have some kind of meaningful dialogue with a group that at this point is still a military organization that's very committed to fighting the government, not participating in the political process. And there's more than one insurgency that Afghanistan faces. There's the Quetta Shura, that's one group. There's the Haqqani network. There's Hezb Islamic Gulbuddin Hekmatyar's group, which are all engaged in armed opposition against the government. So some of these groups may be more reconcilable. Let's say in the case of Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, some of them are probably not going to be very easily brought to the table. One of the talking points that we get, and I'll leave it here, is that the presidential palace says, well, if the government of Pakistan was able to at least try to initiate some kind of dialogue or talks with the TTP, with the Pakistani Taliban, then why can't the Afghan government talk to the Afghan Taliban? But we've also seen in Pakistan that the efforts to bring dialogue between the government of Islamabad and between the Pakistani Taliban have really faltered because of lots of attacks and violence. So it makes it a lot harder to be optimistic that there can be an immediate and sort of happy outcome here. So I'll leave it at that.
Nathan, before we ask another question, did just your response to that raise the question which I think must be on other people's minds, is certainly on mine, and that is when you talked about the upcoming elections, you said there's likely to be a second round. So the elections are going to take place in April. If there's a second round, when would it take place? Or to put the question in the most graphic terms, when would it be possible for any new government to actually assume power in Kabul, whether the elections are fair or unfair, whether it's one round or two rounds, but probably two rounds. And then I guess what really makes this question to me so immediate and palpable is would Karzai, who's obviously said he's not going to sign a security agreement, would it make it almost impossible for any government that comes in, let's say in June or July, to reverse that decision in time to avoid a zero outcome?
Right. So let's just sort of kind of play this out here. So the election's on April 5th, and that means that gives you another couple of weeks for protests with counting of ballots. Most realistically, according to the Independent Election Commission, you don't have a second vote until sometime later in May. And that means then you would have to leave more time after that for the counting of the votes, the adjudication of any disputes and things like that. So sometime by mid to late summer, maybe you could have a new government if everything goes according to plan. One thing that militaries do like is they like to plan. They like advanced planning. And it makes it extremely difficult because you're bumping up against a couple of things, which is the beginning of a new fiscal year for the U.S. government. But you're also looking at European governments that also want to plan in advance for what the deployments for their militaries are going to be and don't like this kind of uncertainty. So the temptation, of course, is there to say, look, we don't have enough advanced plan for planning. Now the U.S. military is saying that they're flexible enough that they can kind of work around things, but you're definitely bumping up against some pretty hard deadlines. There's also a NATO meeting here at the end of this month where they're going to be discussing some of these things. It's really going to be increasingly difficult, whether it's in the United States or in Europe, to persuade Congress or parliaments to continue funding and paying for a mission and the deployment of troops when there's incredible uncertainty as to whether or not they can have this kind of deal which provides the actual umbrella they need for the deployment. So,
well, there's somebody else who's got their hand up who wants to talk about, and I want to call on this individual, but I want you to just end this last answer by telling us what happens to Bagram Air Base if the zero option is followed.
Bagram's an interesting case, right? So Bagram is this. At one point, I think at its peak, about 30,000 people were there, contractors and uniformed military, and it's a base that's north of Kabul. It also has a detention facility that's also been a big source of controversy. But Bagram is possibly, if there is a U.S. presence after 2014, would be where a good chunk of the U.S. military forces would be based. Without the zero option, I think it could become if there's a zero option, it could become a ghost town. And this sort of well, I mean, it's an interesting place in general. Bagram is a massive air base that has sort of well, it's almost like a sort of a small American town that's been transplanted into the high desert plain north of Kabul. But there's no reason why it can't go away. I covered Iraq as well, and I remember seeing these huge base complexes like Camp Victory that sort of turned into dusty ghost towns after as the U.S. military withdrew. So despite the size of the commitment, there's no reason why these kinds of bases, whether it's in Bagram, in Kandahar, Jalalabad, can't go away. They can't shut down or can't be handed over to the Afghan government. Obviously, it's really hard to maintain any kind of presence, to launch and recover aircraft, to have a significant force, unless you have some of the air power to back it up. So Bagram is going to be key.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Hi, my name is Adem. I'm a campus planner here at Duke. What are the roles of other regional stakeholders in Afghanistan, in particular the adjacent neighbors of Iran and China?
Well, Afghanistan is a neighbor with China only through the narrow sliver of the Wakhan corridor. But China is, in the future, a prospective very large investor in Afghanistan, especially in the minerals industry, which is seen as the only real true hope that Afghanistan has of collecting enough revenue that it can actually cover its government expenditure. The other neighbors, obviously Pakistan, which is has a military and an intelligence apparatus that sees Afghanistan as a part of its strategic depth. That is a place that they can fall back on when confronting their main traditional adversary, which is India. Iran is in flux right now politically because there is the prospect of an opening to the United States and the West, which is still very nascent at this point, but Iran potentially also could play a very important role in Afghanistan. And then there are the neighbors to the north, the former Soviet republics, ones that we refer to informally as the Stans, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, which share borders with Afghanistan, and which provide a lot of the commerce and resources that a city like Kabul depends on, just so it can stay running. Those countries all have, they're in flux themselves, I think, politically. Tajikistan is, they're along the route for the export of opium and narcotics originating from Afghanistan, on their way through Russia to Europe. So Afghanistan to them is seen as a potentially destabilizing factor. These are also countries that seem to me relatively inwardly focused. The ones that are most actively involved in Afghan affairs are Pakistan and Iran, and to a certain extent as well India, which you could say there is Afghanistan is seen as somewhat of an arena for strategic competition. But what we haven't seen is any kind of effort to really fix Afghanistan's largest problem, which is the fact that it's landlocked and that it does not really have a way to trade with the outside world without cooperating with its neighbors. So this really incredibly complicates matters and transportation routes. There's sort of maybe an idea or a vision that Afghanistan could be the heart of some kind of new communications network that links Central Asia with South Asia, but that's going to involve railways, roads, infrastructure, lots of other stuff, billions of dollars that basically haven't been spent here. So, pretty difficult part of the world.
Well, I think we only have about 5 minutes left, and I'd like to just make one further comment, and then ask Jayne for either her comment or question. And mine is, let's assume the zero option doesn't happen, and the U.S. lingers and Afghanistan limps for the next 5 years. If we're looking back from 2020 at this period of time, and we're doing it from an Afghan perspective, will there be any difference between their view of the Soviet occupation from effectively 1979 to 1989, that 10-year period, and what has now been the longest war the United States has had, NATO under NATO auspices, but American-led war in Afghanistan from 2001 to at least 2014 and maybe 2016. So from an Afghan perspective, looking to 2020, what will be their view? Will there be any difference between the disaster of the Soviet occupation and the hope of the American one?
Well, I'll take this question and maybe try to leave with at least one note of optimism here, which is that if we can make some qualitative comparisons between the Soviet way of war and the American style counterinsurgency. You have to remember that in the 1980s, millions of Afghans were displaced by the fighting. The war cost them many, many more lives. And there was much more indiscriminate use of firepower. There is just less. There's a completely, I'd say, a different way of war. Although the United States certainly, I think, probably repeated some of the mistakes that the Soviets may have made. There's also, I think, it's really interesting to live in a city like Kabul right now because we have a city that does have, like I said, some beginnings of a middle class. Kabul, despite all of its problems, is a city that continues to function. And there is a young and forward-looking generation of youth that don't want to associate themselves with the warlordism and the civil war of the 1990s, that identify themselves as Afghans and who don't identify themselves necessarily along ethnic lines. Afghanistan has a very robust and vital press compared to its neighbors, I think. And they enjoy, I think, a much more healthy level of dissent and political dialogue than many of its neighbors, and that's a very healthy thing. As messy as the elections may be, there's, I think, still a high degree of interest in political participation here. And to not borrow a talking point from the coalition, a lot more children are going to school. So getting at one of the main problems of Afghanistan, which is an incredibly low level of literacy, I think is being chipped away at steadily. And people have more sources of information here than they would have had 10 or 15 years ago. Proliferation of cell phones, even though internet penetration is really low, people have a whole lot more information available to them about what the world outside looks like through television, through radio, through the internet than they would have had before. And that leaves me a little bit more optimistic that there's not going to be just like a version of the 1990s, take two. It's going to be doom and gloom. There's going to be some really difficult problems ahead. And we've seen in other countries how quickly things can unravel, even in a situation where you've got a developed economy and an educated population. Syria would be a really good case in point. But I'd hope that Afghanistan, maybe 10 years ago, the thought was that Afghanistan was tired enough of war, that people didn't have an appetite for fighting. Unfortunately, these problems are still being hashed out through force. And I do think that this era would be viewed differently than the Soviet occupation, just in part because of the sheer level of violence. It would be hard to even compare. Certainly, it's not a nice situation here today in Afghanistan. Lots of lives are still being lost. It's still a violent place in certain parts of the country, but I don't think we have anywhere near the level of violence and mayhem that you would have seen during the Civil War of the 90s or the Soviet occupation of the 80s. That being said, I think Afghans, people I talk to every day, really do have a fervent wish. It's really interesting just talking to Afghans who are watching the events in Ukraine today, watching a country that's in transition, where people were able to go out on the streets and sort of show some kind of people power and stand up to a corrupt government, and feel that some of these problems aren't insurmountable. Again, this is a generation of people who are much more plugged in than they would have been in the past. So it's an interesting time to be here, and we'll see what happens with the elections.
Thank you, Nathan. Jayne has one last comment here.
I think, to say that I think it's very important to have that vision of optimism and to think about what it means to move toward more cohesive and reconciled community, but just to be very mindful that in that process, that women's rights are not left off the table, that they're not seen as unduly divisive, and so forth too. And I think the transitional period is going to be a real litmus test for how women's rights issues are approached in this context.
Well, on that happy note, Nathan, let me give you a long-distance salute and thank you. And to Jayne nearby, thank you. And all of you who came out today, thank you for being here for this event.